All right, welcome to your deep dive. This one is going to be pretty heavy.
Yeah.
We're looking at the life and crimes of Raymond Eugene Johnson.
Yeah.
You gave us a lot of material on this guy.
You weren't kidding.
Court documents, news articles, even some handwritten notes.
Mm.
Raymond Eugene Johnson is currently on death row in Oklahoma.
Right.
And one of the things that stood out to me in preparing for this deep dive was that this wasn't his first time in prison for a violent crime.
No, not at all. And that's something that I find very interesting about this case. We see this a lot, this kind of escalation of criminal activity.
Yeah, back in 1995, he was actually convicted of manslaughter, served some time, got paroled, and then things took a really, really dark turn.
Yeah.
So let's rewind all the way back to that 1995 case.
Mm-hmm.
What landed a 21-year-old Raymond Eugene Johnson behind bars?
Well, so it all started in September of '95. Johnson was involved in an altercation with a man named Clarence Ray Oliver.
Okay.
And according to police reports and the subsequent court documents, it seems like it was a heated argument that very quickly escalated. Johnson brandished a gun, and Oliver, sensing the danger, tried to flee.
Oh, wow.
In his car.
So already we're seeing someone try to get away from this guy.
Exactly. And very tragically, Oliver was not successful in his attempt to escape. Johnson actually fired shots at the car, hitting Oliver through the passenger side window.
Oh, my God.
And Oliver crashed his car and was found dead the following day.
Wow. So it sounds like from the start, there was a very clear intent to harm.
That's a very important point to bring up, especially when you consider the legal outcome of this case.
Okay.
Johnson did not face trial for murder.
Really?
He struck a plea deal instead.
Oh, wow.
Pleading guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter.
So he admitted to killing this man, but avoided a murder trial altogether.
Yes.
What was the sentence for taking a life under those circumstances?
He received a 20-year prison sentence.
20 years.
Yeah.
You've worked on so many cases like this. Does that seem typical given the circumstances and especially the fact that, this poor man was trying to get away?
Well, sentencing guidelines can vary a lot from state to state, and judges have to take a lot of things into consideration,
Right.
criminal history, nature of the crime, and in this case, a plea deal was involved.
Right.
So, the fact that Johnson did accept responsibility and the victim's family agreed to the plea deal, that likely played a role in the ultimate sentence.
Yeah.
However, it definitely raises some questions about whether 20 years was really enough.
Yeah.
Considering the severity of the crime and the potential for future violence.
That's a chilling thought,
Yeah.
especially knowing what we know about what happened later.
And he didn't serve the full 20 years.
No, he didn't. And this is where things take that really dark turn that you mentioned.
Right.
He was granted parole in 2005.
After only serving part of his sentence for taking a life.
Right.
What do parole boards look at when they're making these kinds of decisions? I mean, how could they let someone like this out?
It's a really difficult job that they have. They have to assess the inmates' behavior while they were incarcerated.
Right. Their participation in rehab programs, psychological evaluations, things like that. They also have to try to figure out,
Right.
what kind of risk they would pose to society if they were released.
Yeah, it's not an exact science.
It's not. And in Johnson's case, it sounds like they really missed the mark.
Yeah, they did. And this is where we meet Brooke Whitaker and her 4 children.
Yes.
And the sources you provided paint a picture of a pretty tumultuous relationship from the start.
It was. It was definitely a tumultuous relationship. We see stalking, verbal abuse, even death threats made by Johnson toward Whitaker.
It's just terrifying to think about what this poor woman was going through. Did she ever try to get help?
She did. She filed a restraining order against Johnson in April of 2007.
Good for her.
To protect herself and her children.
Right.
I mean, this is clearly a desperate attempt to try to get out of a very dangerous situation.
Absolutely. You would think that a restraining order would offer some level of protection.
Yeah.
I mean, was Johnson deterred at all by this?
Sadly, no. And what happened next really just highlights how fragile these protective measures can be.
Okay.
So a court hearing for this restraining order was scheduled for the following month.
Okay.
But neither Johnson nor Whitaker appeared in court.
They both missed the hearing.
They did. And the sources don't really give a clear explanation as to why.
Wow.
But because they didn't show up, the restraining order was dropped.
Oh, my gosh.
And it's just, it's a tragic example of even when victims do take steps to try to protect themselves,
Yeah.
the system can still fail them.
It's a gut-wrenching thought. And we know this is really a turning point in the story because less than 2 months after that restraining order was dropped, tragedy struck again.
Yes.
And this time the violence was even more horrific.
On June 23, 2007, Johnson attacked Whitaker in her home. He was using a hammer.
Oh my gosh.
He beat her so badly that her skull was nearly fractured.
That's unimaginable.
But the brutality didn't stop there.
Oh no.
He then doused her with gasoline and set her on fire.
That's just monstrous. Where were her children during this attack?
Tragically, Whitaker's 7-month-old daughter, Kaya, was also in the home at the time, and she was caught in the fire.
Oh my God.
Firefighters got Whitaker to the hospital, but sadly, both she and Kaya died from their injuries.
2 lives just senselessly snuffed out in such a brutal way. I mean, this isn't just about legal proceedings anymore. This is about the very real human cost of unchecked violence.
You're absolutely right. We have to look beyond just, the legal terms and look at the actual pain and suffering
Right.
inflicted on the victims and their families.
After these horrific acts, was Johnson apprehended?
Yes, he was apprehended very quickly, and according to the police reports, he confessed to both murders.
It's chilling that someone could commit such acts and then so readily admit to them.
Yeah.
What happened next in terms of the legal proceedings?
Well, given the, horrible nature of what happened, the prosecution decided to seek the death penalty.
Yeah.
Johnson's trial took place in 2009. It was a very high-profile case.
I bet.
The evidence against him was just overwhelming. He was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree arson.
And the jury's verdict.
They sentenced him to death for each of the murders and life imprisonment for the arson charge.
So Raymond Eugene Johnson is on death row, awaiting his fate.
Mm.
But this story isn't over, is it?
No, it isn't. There's still more to tell about the legal battles that followed and really about the complexities of how the justice system operates in cases as horrific as this one.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've established Raymond Eugene Johnson's pattern of escalating violence. From the 95 manslaughter case to the absolutely brutal murders of Brooke and Kaya Whitaker in 2007.
Right.
Now he sits on death row, convicted and awaiting his fate. But I'm kind of curious about what happened between 2009, when he was sentenced, and today. Did he try to appeal the verdict at all?
He did. He filed a lot of appeals, actually.
Oh.
And, all of them are documented very thoroughly in these files you gave me.
Right.
What I found interesting is that his legal challenges didn't just focus on getting his conviction overturned.
Really? What else did he go after?
One case in particular kind of caught my eye.
Yeah.
It involves a pretty unusual subject, sexually explicit materials.
That's not what I expected to hear.
Yeah.
What was the issue there?
So in 2012, while he was on death row, Johnson filed a lawsuit challenging a prison policy that didn't allow inmates to have sexually explicit materials
Wow.
in their cells.
Interesting.
His argument was that this policy was violating his First Amendment rights.
Wow. That is a fascinating twist. It really highlights the fact that the legal system is so complex, even on death row. Inmates still have certain rights.
Absolutely.
And they can challenge policies that they feel are unfair.
Exactly. It all comes down to the principle of due process, which basically means that everyone, even those convicted of terrible crimes, deserves fair treatment under the law.
Right. And it's hard to feel a lot of sympathy for someone like Johnson who committed these horrific acts. But I can see how upholding those constitutional rights, even for death row inmates, is really important for the integrity of the system.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely a delicate balance. And this case, while it kind of seems like a sideshow to the main story, really reveals a lot about Johnson's personality and his willingness to fight for what he believes in, even when he's on death row.
Did he win this case? Were his First Amendment rights actually violated by this prison policy?
The sources don't really say what happened with this specific case.
Okay.
But they do go on to talk about the reasoning behind these kinds of policies and the debate over prisoners' rights in general.
Yeah. It makes you wonder about life on death row and what it's really like for these people just waiting for their execution. It's easy to imagine this really stark, silent existence, but then you see a case like this, and you realize that there's still legal battles happening. These inmates are still trying to assert their rights and engage with the system in some pretty unexpected ways.
You're right. It reminds us that even in these extreme situations, life goes on and the law continues to work in sometimes surprising ways.
So let's get back to Johnson's appeals regarding his conviction. You said he filed numerous appeals. Were any of them successful?
Unfortunately for Johnson, no. Every appeal he filed, including a final appeal to the Supreme Court in 2019, was denied.
Wow.
These documents really lay out just how rigorous the process is for appealing a death penalty sentence.
Yes.
Every single detail is scrutinized, the evidence is examined again and again, and the legal arguments are just fiercely debated.
It's going to be a really long and difficult process for both the person on death row and the families of the victims, too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every appeal probably just brings back all the pain of the past for those families.
Right.
It's a constant reminder of what they've lost, and it must be so hard to find any sense of closure when these legal battles just drag on and on.
So, with all of the appeals exhausted, an execution date must have been set at some point. What does that process look like?
Well, in Oklahoma, once someone has gone through all their appeals, the attorney general has to request an execution date from the Court of Criminal Appeals. And they did this for Johnson in 2023. The execution was initially set for May 2nd, 2024.
Okay, but today is obviously past that date, and he's still alive. What happened?
It was postponed. Oklahoma's attorney general actually asked for longer breaks between executions.
Really?
Yeah, they said that the Department of Corrections was really strained and they didn't have enough resources to carry out executions so
Nothing here.
frequently.
Well, so Raymond Eugene Johnson
Yeah.
is still on death row, waiting for a new execution date. This deep dive has really shown us a lot about his crimes, his legal battles,
Yeah.
and just the complicated inner workings of the justice system. But I can't help but think there's still something we haven't really talked about,
What's that?
the death penalty itself.
Right.
We've kind of touched on it, but we haven't really delved into all the ethical considerations surrounding this very controversial practice.
Yeah, you're right. That's a big one.
Here we are. Raymond Eugene Johnson sits on death row waiting for a new execution date. And it really brings us to this big question, the death penalty. It's a topic that sparks so much debate, so many arguments on both sides. And it forces us to think about some really, really tough stuff about justice and punishments.
It does.
Right.
Such a complicated issue with really no easy answers.
Right.
You know, it's been a part of legal systems for centuries, but it's facing so much scrutiny these days
Yeah.
with, good points being made on both sides of the argument.
Right. You've spent years studying the criminal justice system. You've seen so many cases. You analyze all the details of these legal processes.
Yeah.
I'm curious from your perspective, what are your thoughts on the death penalty, especially in a case like Johnson's, where the crimes are so undeniably awful?
That's a question I ask myself a lot.
Hmm.
On one hand, you have this argument for retribution,
Right.
the idea that some crimes are so horrible, so damaging to society that
Right.
the only fair punishment is death.
Yeah.
People who support the death penalty often talk about the need for closure for the victims' families.
Right.
That sense that justice has been served when the person who committed the crime faces that ultimate consequence.
And it's totally understandable that people feel that way, especially when you think about all the pain and suffering that the victims and their families have gone through.
Exactly.
But then there's the other side, the arguments against the death penalty.
Right.
The idea that it's cruel and unusual punishment,
Yeah.
that doesn't really stop crime from happening.
Yeah.
And maybe the most important argument, that there's always a risk of executing an innocent person.
Exactly. And that's the core of the whole debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
The possibility of taking an innocent life, of making a mistake that you can never, ever undo.
Right.
It's a huge weight for any society to carry. And then you have the moral question, too.
Right.
Does the state actually have the right to take life, even if it's in the name of justice?
Yeah.
It really challenges our beliefs about how sacred human life is and if people can ever truly be redeemed.
Those are really tough questions.
Yeah.
Seems like public opinion must be pretty divided on this issue. Are there any clear trends in how people view the death penalty these days?
There are trends, and they're definitely changing. While support for the death penalty still exists, it has been going down over the last few decades. I think more and more people are starting to think about the moral and ethical questions. They're not so sure it actually stops crime.
Right.
And they're starting to support other types of punishment,
Right.
ones that focus on rehabilitation and restoring justice to the victims.
So as Raymond Eugene Johnson sits on death row,
Yeah.
his fate is kind of tied to these bigger societal questions. What can we learn from his story? What insights can we take away from this deep dive into his life and his crimes?
Well, I think Johnson's case, even though it's a truly terrible story, is kind of a small example of how complicated our justice system really is.
Yeah.
It shows us how difficult rehabilitation can be, how important it is to have due process, even for people who've done awful things, and how we're always trying to find that right balance between punishing someone and acknowledging that they could maybe change for the better.
It's a reminder that these aren't just, abstract ideas we're talking about. These are real people's lives.
Yeah.
Raymond Eugene Johnson, Brooke Whitaker, Kaya Whitaker. Their lives are all woven together in this horrible story. And it makes us confront some hard truths about ourselves and our society and the systems that we depend on for justice.
I think that's a really powerful way to put it. This deep dive wasn't just about figuring out the facts of this case. It was about starting a conversation, encouraging people to think critically, and reminding everyone that the search for justice never really ends.
Well said. And to everyone listening out there, I hope this deep dive has given you some new insights and made you curious to learn more and maybe even challenge your own views on crime punishment and the fact that people can be capable of both good and evil.
Right.
Remember, the conversation doesn't stop here. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep trying to understand the world around us a little bit better.
Thanks for coming with us on this journey. Until next time.